Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. We're really excited to show you what we've been working on in this past year, a little over a year or so. My name is Tanya Nocera. I'm an assistant professor of practice at Ohio State University in the Department of Biomedical Engineering, and I have with me here today Monica Ocon, who is my lead graduate teaching assistant. We teach all upper-level laboratories in our department here, and what we're going to show you today is how we have incorporated LabArchives into our upper-level biomedical engineering lab courses and how we've assessed their impact on our students' learning. So this is going to be a two-part presentation. Both of these are from something that we put together and presented at the American Society for Engineering Education this past June. So you'll see here, if you're interested in looking up that full paper for both this one and then the study we'll show you partway through, there's a URL there that you can follow to read the full paper. My first half, I'm going to talk to you about the perspective from the instructor, so how electronic lab notebooks impact biomedical engineering students' documentation and technical communication skills. And then partway through, I'm going to switch over to Monica, and she is going to talk to you about the student educational experience of electronic laboratory notebooks, so looking at it from the student perspective. So without further ado, what you see here is something I see quite often in my courses, even in my lab courses, where students are constantly on some sort of device. They're continually connected. And whether that be working on social media or using digital technology or cloud computing, it seems like they always have something in their hands and they're always connecting what they're doing somehow through technology. So we started noticing this and wondering, how could we harness the things that our students are coming through our program with, these skills that maybe they aren't using for engineering related documentation, and how can we harness that to help them develop that technical communication skill that they so desperately need as we send them off into the workforce. So as an engineering program, we are accredited by ABET, and one of our student outcomes, according to that agency, is that our students need to have an ability to communicate effectively. And so as technology changes, that effectiveness or how to communicate effectively also changes. So in order for us to stay in line with that and also help our students be effective technical communicators in the 21st century, we decided to make the leap from paper-based into electronic notebooks and see how that impacts our students' documentation and technical communication skills. So what this first half of the talk is about, like I mentioned, is how the electronic lab notebooks, and I may shorten that to ELNs because it's kind of a mouthful. We're going to see how that impact of ELNs on students' documentation and technical communication skills from the instructor's perspective. We're going to take a look into that. So the study that we did to compare our students' performance, we looked at a biomechanics laboratory course that I teach it's typically in the junior year of our biomedical engineering curriculum. In autumn of 2015, the students that took that biomechanics course took it with paper-based notebook keeping, whereas in autumn 2016, we transitioned over to electronic lab notebooks using LabArchives Classroom Edition. And everything about that course, other than how we asked them to document, was exactly the same. The experiments they were doing, how they interacted with the teaching faculty and staff that were working with them in the labs. We can also say that there were very similar in caliber types of students between these two semesters that we looked at. There wasn't a significant difference between their overall final laboratory scores of the students in both the autumn 15 and autumn 16 cohorts. And there were, as you can see here, N equals 33 students we looked at in each semester. So a little bit of what it looked like between the two semesters. We asked the students to do the exact same thing, whether they were keeping their notes on paper-based or keeping it in electronic on LabArchives. We gave them a little bit of a tutorial, like you see here on the left on PaperBased, of the types of things we were looking for in a good, well-documented notebook. And then at the same time, we set up a similar template on LabArchives that had the headers that a good lab notebook should have within it. We pushed that template out to the students for them to fill in. So all the same things that you see here were very similar. They had titles, objectives, and these other items were in that the paper-based tutorial we gave them as well. And this is a list of all of the requirements that we gave them that form the basis of their grades on their notebooks. And so the paper-based, you'll see very similar things as far as organization and how informative they are, but we did change some of that that verbiage depending on if it was paper versus electronic, such as write in pen, not pencil. That didn't make sense in the electronic format. And over in the electronic format, all uploads should have good resolution. That's something that made sense in that format. But as far as content goes, we set the same expectations, whether it was paper or electronic notebooks. There was one small difference in how we approached the feedback we gave the students. So when it was paper-based, students were required to show the notebook from that day of lab to a graduate teaching assistant or GTA to receive formative feedback. So, and that was verbal because it was paper-based. So the students physically walked their notebook to their teaching assistant at the end of lab. The teaching assistant glanced over it and verbally gave them feedback on things they were doing well, as well as things that they should work on and improve as they came back the next time to lab. When we switched to electronic, that feedback then took on an electronic form. So the teaching assistants were able to log into the ELN platform or LabArchives between the lab sessions, and they could electronically review and leave electronic feedback that was written for the students to log in and read that way. So that is one difference that we had for them. Either way, the students were graded on the same rubric between both semesters. And that included how well they captured these different sections and the requirements that went along with it. So that included, did they clearly give us a title and objective of what they were doing that day? How do their materials and methods, how are they communicated? How are their results and discussions documented and communicated, as well as their observations and notes, and how they presented their overall notebook? Was it neat and organized? Were their figures labeled? And did they also exhibit improvement as we gave them that feedback in between each lab session? So that was the same whether it was paper-based or the ELN format. So we wanted to find out, our research question was, did the electronic format impact students' communication, documentation, and presentation skills? So Monica and I created this separate rubric to be able to assess those three items: communication, documentation, and presentation. We took all the student submissions from those 2 autumn semesters for biomechanics and went back through all of them and scored them on this developed rubric that we made to measure those 3 areas. So we scored them as whether or not each notebook meets, partially meets, or does not meet. So a 2, 1, or 0 score for each of these assessment criteria. So for communication, we looked at items such as, did the daily overall objective, was that written clearly? Was the background information clearly supported by the daily objective? Did the description of the experiments, was that presented clearly? Is the purpose of each experiment clearly written? And overall, did the written communication meet the expectations of what was set out of the students at the beginning of the semesters? For the documentation area, we looked at how the methods are documented and were they done so in an appropriate detail? Were the experimental observations clearly documented? Were all experiments there? And also looking at the overall quality of the documentation. And for presentation, we were looking for, was all of the data appended to the notebook? Was the organization there and was it logical? And again, the overall notebook presentation meeting the expectations of the course. So all 33 notebooks from each semester were scored on this rubric, and that is how we were able to do a quantitative comparison between our paper-based and our electronic notebooks. And what we found for those three main categories we were interested in, the communication, documentation, and presentation, that there was a statistically significant improvement in all three of those areas when the students were using the electronic notebooks compared to the paper-based notebooks. We also looked at the overall score for both the notebooks, and the overall score for the electronics submissions were also statistically significant as an improvement over the paper notebooks. So Monica looked at this very closely and pulled out some of the key features that the electronic notebooks that the students submitted had in each of those categories compared to the paper-based notebook. So for the communication category, the ELNs were the student submissions that were electronic. They were able to describe a clear and measurable objective far more often than the students submitting a paper-based notebook. They also clearly communicated what was being completed in the lab session, used appropriate technical jargon, and they were able to restate the goals of the experiment appropriately. In the documentation category, student ELN submissions more thoroughly summarized the lab methodology, and they included videos and photos as well, which was something they could easily append in an electronic format. For documentation, they also were able to document their experimental observations and match them back to the daily lab goals more often in the ELN format than what we were seeing in the paper-based format. As for the presentation category, the ELNs had complete, well-organized, and easy-to-follow notes more often than the paper-based. And also in the ELN format, all the raw data was appended and analyzed more often. And when I say analyzed, we mean that plots and tables and other ways to analyze and present the data were included more often in the ELNs than were attached or stapled into their paper-based notebooks. The things that we think were very unique to being in the electronic format in particular are what are highlighted in red here. So the videos and photos are something you just cannot do in a paper-based format. And so having that advantage in the electronic format was something that the students really embraced, and also took the level of their documentation from okay to pretty well detailed. So that was really, really neat to see. For presentation, being well organized, the students could go back and very easily revise what they're doing or move the organization around. So we call that a nonlinear revision of their notebooks. You can't really do that on paper. Once you start writing, everything gets added pretty linearly. So this was something that really helped them be well organized in the electronic format. And then the ability to attach plots, tables, so you can attach Excel files, you can attach MATLAB scripts, MATLAB plots, or other, if you're writing code or other types of formats, PDFs and whatnot. We really saw the students embrace that feature as well, and it allowed them to be more complete in how they documented all of their data and outcomes from their laboratory experiments. I did want to just circle back real quick on that nonlinear data entry point, because I really think that this was really important in how the students were able to improve their lab notebook keeping skills. So I mentioned the students could revisit, revise, and address their teaching assistant feedback, which I mentioned earlier. The TAs were doing that electronically for them right through the LabArchives platform. And the students were also able to update and add to their notebooks non-linearly throughout the laboratory experience, inside and outside of the lab, which is important to point out because we might mention this in the student feedback portion, but some of the comments that we got from students was, well, before when I did paper-based notebooks, I never really thought about my experiments much or went back to my notebook outside of lab, whereas students, when we surveyed them, when they're completing their electronic notebook, they said, you know, this format and getting the feedback electronically made me want to revisit my notebook outside of labs, think about what I was doing more and add more to my documentation. So we thought that was a really interesting piece of feedback that we received. So I do want to show you a quick example of what a really good, and what I mean really good is this was probably one of the best paper-based notebooks that we received. Not all of them looked this neat or had as much detail as what you're seeing here. But I do want to point out some of the differences between that paper-based and the electronic and what they could and could not do. The one thing they could do more easily was to sketch in the paper-based, but actually the sketch feature was just added into the LabArchives toolbox. And so we actually started labs this week, and I showed the students the sketch feature, and they were really excited and started adding sketches into their electronic notebooks. So that is something that has been addressed and can be incorporated electronically now. What you see here, materials and methods. On paper-based, my students were trying to handwrite out all of their methods. They're basically wasting time copying from a lab manual, whereas here they can, you know, it's a little hard to see, but these are PDFs that they could upload and then write comments and add extra detail to, and so that was a time saver for them. They also could upload their raw data instead of just hand sketching their data. This is actual data files that they could re-download and reanalyze later. You also see down here, these are links to Excel documents where they had more raw data appended into their notebook. So having that electronic access where students can save all their data, go back to one place, pull it back out, look at it again, save their plots, and have it all visually in one place was really taking their documentation up a whole nother level. Warning, there were some side effects for these notebooks that I want to make you aware of. Students may actually begin paying attention, such as watching, videoing, and taking photos of their experiments instead of texting or Candy Crushing or Facebooking. We did notice that shift of they had these electronic devices, they were playing around with them anyways, but if you give them something to do with them that's productive towards what they're working towards in the lab, they actually start using them and paying more attention. So that was a neat side effect that we weren't quite anticipating. The other side effect is the more detailed documentation may lead to a deeper understanding of course material and improved laboratory report submissions. So stay tuned. We hope to link in the future, if that's something you're interested in, on how these students' documentation skills are translating into really good lab report writing skills. That's something on our future to-do list. There are a few factors that could have potentially influenced the result of this study. So some students may have taken another lab course in our department prior to this biomechanics course, and so they may have already had a little bit of practice with documentation, so that could have skewed their outcomes of how they performed in those lab notebooks when we went back and analyzed them. The quality of the formative feedback that my TAs were giving the students in between the days of their lab sessions may have varied. I had 3 different TAs in the fall of 2015 compared to 3 different ones that I had in the fall of 2016. So they may have received a little bit of a different style or extent of feedback variation between which TA gave them that feedback. We also wanted to point out that the written feedback in the ELNs, and by written I mean electronic written, may have been more accessible to the students than just hearing it verbally. So having that really documented alongside their notebook may have made it easier for them to go back and really improve their notebooks compared to that verbal feedback, and that could have affected the results of this study. For current and future work, the student surveys, that is actually a work in progress, which Monica is going to talk to you about when we switch over here in a few minutes. We also are interested in looking at how the ELNs help students improve their visual communication skills, as well as can they enhance the student teamwork and collaboration in the lab courses. So those we hope to be our next steps through the next year here. But overall, what we'd like to conclude from this study is that the student ELN submissions scored significantly higher in the 3 categories we looked at, which were communication, documentation, and presentation, when we compared that to paper-based submissions. So we are feeling pretty good about ELNs being an effective medium to engage engineering students in practicing and improving documentation and communication skills. I want to thank you. I'm going to show you the references here real quick and the acknowledgments from this study, particularly Monica for doing all of her awesome work with me on this. And again, there's that link to the paper if you're interested in going back. And also a big thank you to LabArchives for all the technical support throughout this past year and giving us this opportunity to show you what we've found and have a discussion today.
So
Great.
I have a question from David Locke. Since paper notebooks would be in pen and not pencil, was there a way to turn on an equivalent to track changes in the electronic format? That way, that the data that was taken out but later remeasured would still appear as lined out instead of being erased like a pencil can.
Oh, okay. So I think I'm understanding the question. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the question is there a way to track how students change their notebook so that it's still all documented even if they erase something? Did I understand that correctly?
That is correct.
Okay. So with LabArchives, they actually will keep a track record of all the versions the previous versions that have changed. And so you can always go back and re-access any edits that have been made to each notebook. So that's something that we could go back and look at from the instructor side. We haven't really seen a need to do that, but it's also something that the students could go back to and see what their previous edits had been, and they could revert back to that data. So it is all saved there for them.
We have another question from Mike Kenny. Did you look for any evidence of sharing between students, both appropriate sharing and inappropriate sharing?
Really great question. So this past year, when we did this last year, we made every student upload or work on their own individual independent notebook. We did tell them we knew who their partner was. They had to identify their lab partner in the top of the page of each page of their notebook, so that when our teaching assistants went through and reviewed their notebooks, they knew who their partner was. We did allow them to share data between the two, so that they were only collecting one set of data, but we did want them to reflect on what they were doing in the lab independently and put their thoughts into that. So because my TAs were looking back in between every lab session and reviewing all of what the students submitted, they could easily see if people were just copying. I don't know if I want to say easily, but it would have stood out if students were just copying and pasting from each other. But we did learn from this experience that students tended to take a little bit longer than they should have because both partners were trying to update their own independent notebook. So we changed that this year. We just started it when our lab started last week, and we linked our student notebooks, and we're allowing both students to submit documentation to the same shared notebook, and that is allowing timestamps. Each student, when they put their entry in, because they're logged in under their own independent accounts, it'll put their name and the timestamp so we know which of the partners is contributing what. And I think that because they're working on it and doing it real time in the labs, there's really no copy paste opportunity or a cheating opportunity if that's something you're concerned about, because they're working on it in real time and they're now having that partner notebook. I hope that helps answer that question.
We have another question from Jenny Mayer. In your opinion, what are the advantages of using an ELN over having students take electronic notes on Microsoft Word or Google Docs?
Great question. What I love about using the ELN, especially with LabArchives in the Classroom Edition, is that it is a platform that myself and my teaching assistants can log into and very easily monitor in real time what all of the students are doing. I personally haven't tried using Google Docs for that, but so I don't know if you could get that similar experience, but the Classroom Edition allows us, if we needed to set up assignments. If we wanted to, we could grade within it. If we wanted to, we could set up rubrics, which that we have definitely done, and use that for scoring and feedback. So that to us was very valuable to do. I don't know if there was anything. I'm going to let Monica add.
No, I would completely agree with Dr. Nocera in the sense of the ability for anyone on the instructional team to go in and monitor student activity. The addition of how to create assignments, or like organizing templates, rubrics. I think that there's just a lot of more tools available in comparison to just working in Google Drive. Dr. Nocera pointed out that GTAs were able to get feedback. We were able to use like a widget to create a rubric in there for students to use. It's just that it's not the same when you're using it in Google Drive.
I did want to add too on that. If you're working in a course that intellectual property is a big component of it, I know at Ohio State we've been told never to keep intellectual property documented on Google Drive because Google is public, whereas keeping it on something that is more secure, such as LabArchives, that is a better process to go with intellectual property. That's not something I'm dealing with here in the lab courses, but something as we think of transitioning and using a platform like LabArchives for our capstone, our senior design courses where intellectual property comes into play, then that could make a difference as well.
And then the last question from Adressa Butler. What types of devices did the students use to input the data into the ELN during lab time, and could they alter it after the lab?
Yes, great question. So the students last year, we told them to bring their own device. We said laptop, tablet, phone. There is a phone app that you can use, and so students could bring their device of choice. This year, we got some feedback from that saying it's kind of difficult to carry around a bulky tablet around the lab, especially we have a tissue engineering lab where students are in a tissue culture hood working with cells, and trying to have a bulky laptop near them during that was just not practical. So we purchased a bunch of little notebook tablets this year that we're testing out for the first time, and we're allowing our students to sign them out and then sign them back in at the end of lab. So I don't know how that's going to work so far. We're only a couple days into it. You can ask me at the end of the semester and I'll let you know. But the students were using their own laptops because LabArchives is web-based. You can log into it through any browser. So yeah, students, as long as they have an internet connection, they can do it from the lab, they can go home, log into it from a different computer, and it's always there for them. It's like a cloud.
Hello again. I'm Monica. I am Dr. Nocera's graduate teaching assistant. Today I'll be talking to you about the student educational experience with electronic lab notebooks. Now, Dr. Nocera did a great job discussing how electronic lab notebooks improve student documentation and technical communication skills. I will now present the student's perspective on electronic lab notebooks. So the first thing is, ABET requires graduating engineering seniors to demonstrate the ability to communicate effectively. In the laboratory learning environment, students are able to practice their documentation and technical communication skills. Today's students are able to communicate electronically through social media and other electronic platforms, and thus computer-mediated activities can provide a familiar setting to educate students. The purpose of the second study was to assess BME students' perception of the impact of electronic lab notebooks on their laboratory motivation, documentation, and communication skills. To provide a bit more feedback on how electronic lab notebooks were delivered to students, I'll discuss this a little bit in more detail. Prior to lab, students received an electronic lab notebook, also known as ELNs, that includes what is required in the lab notebook, a daily template, an example of a completed notebook, a daily feedback form, and a rubric. During the lab, students bring their own devices and complete their ELN as they go through the lab. Students are then able to attach documents, pictures, and data at this time. After the lab, GTAs, graduate teaching assistants, will go over each student's ELN and provide feedback before the next lab. Students are able to then go back into their lab notebook and revise their notebooks based off of this feedback. This process continues to repeat until the end of the lab course. At the end of the semester, we surveyed these students in Qualtrics to ask them questions about the impact of ELNs on their motivation, documentation, and technical communication skills. These questions from this survey were based on our University Center for Advancement of Teaching. What you can see here is an example of the electronic lab notebook template that we gave to students, the lab notebook requirements that were also located in LabArchives, as well as the questionnaire that we sent to students while using Qualtrics. We used both Likert scope questions as well as open-end questions. So the results of the study, from 35 responses, that a majority of these students agreed that ELNs, electronic lab notebooks, positively impacted their laboratory motivation, documentation, and communication skills. And in particular, they said that ELNs enhanced their ability to be well organized. It also helped their ability to document lab procedures as well as additional info needed to meet instructor expectations. It also helped enhance their ability to store data collected in labs, as well as the rubrics in ELNs help them gauge their strengths and weaknesses in their notebook keeping, as well as it helps them enhance their ability to communicate effectively, as well as incorporate that feedback that we've received. Lastly, in terms of time efficiency, they found that they preferred ELNs over paper. Previously, I said that we also asked them open-ended questions. In Qualtrics, you're able to do like a word blurb, and so this is a representation of the most popular words that were used in the responses. So when we focus on this question here of what knowledge and skills did the electronic lab notebooks help you acquire, you can see here that the words that most students use reflect back into what we found in the Likert scale questions. In terms of organization and documentation, a lot of students talked about those skills helping them. Additionally, from the survey, we did find some challenges. The first thing is that there was a short learning curve. Students are expected, as soon as the lab starts on the first day, to know how to use ELN. Even though we provided information on how to, tutorials beforehand, they were expected as soon as lab started to know how to use ELN. And so students did comment about the short learning curve. Of course, when you're talking about the use of personal devices, Dr. Nocera did point on this, did talk about this, that it can add additional clutter to benchtops while using experiments. If you're walking around with a personal device, or in addition to the laptops used in lab, it creates a lot of clutter. Of course, you always have to worry about being distracted by using your own personal device, especially when there's Facebook on your computer, there's game apps. There's a temptation to be distracted. And then lastly, students always want one interface. And so there was a desire from the students to have an integration with our university learning management system with ELN feedback and grading processes. However, overall, based off of the survey, we did find that a majority of the students did agree that ELNs positively impacted their motivation, documentation, and communication skills. We noted that they also had a preference of ELNs over paper-based notebooks. And we think that, and Dr. Nocera also talked about this, it's due to that nonlinear editing processes, the fact that you can easily attach data, which was also emphasized in the Likert scale question, as well as sharing data, videos, photos, and procedures were all easily available with ELNs versus on paper. We hope with future studies that we are able to identify additional factors, or these factors that actually help students prefer this ELN preference over paper-based notebooks. And of course, we would like to do additional studies to address this as a medium for teaching documentation and effective communication skills. And that is the conclusion of my talk. And so if you have questions, we are all ears.
Dr. Nocera, can you discuss briefly what your plans are moving forward? Because I believe you had mentioned you're going to be doing some additional studying with the ELN with mobile in the classroom.
Yeah. So this semester, we after these studies, we were encouraged to stick with the ELN format based on student feedback and our own evaluation of how the students improve their skills between that paper-based and the electronic format. So we just implemented it. We decided to do, I mentioned the partner notebooks this year. And so one of the things that we are planning to evaluate this year is how teamwork and collaboration, how those skills are being developed by using the collaborative online electronic notebook platform. So something we've just noticed in this first week of labs already is that students are verbally communicating with each other a lot more than they were doing whenever they were writing on paper. When they were on paper, they had their heads down, taking their own notes and not really discussing what they were doing. But now that they're collaborating on a notebook in electronic format, they are discussing, I'm going to add this to the notebook. What do you think? And the other partner will say, that sounds good. You work on that while I add this in. And then they will actually talk about what each other added and whether or not that made sense. So I'm really excited just in 1 week to see that inter-student interaction, and hopefully we'll be able to develop an assessment that can look at how this platform is helping with teamwork skills, which again, we mentioned our accrediting unit, which is ABET, and the ability to work on teams, particularly multidisciplinary teams, is one of our ABET student outcomes. So it would be great to have another way to measure that through this format. I also mentioned that we purchased the tablets. Those are the Lenovo Yoga books, is what they're called. They're pretty cool so far. They come with a stylus. They flip all the way backwards and can take photos. So I saw students have them set up in the biomechanics lab this past week, and they were filming full screen long videos of their experiments with these tablets. They were pulling out and sketching their ideas right into their notebooks, which before they would maybe sketch things on paper and take a picture of it and upload it, which is still a way for them to get things saved electronically, and that still worked out fine. But having that direct interface helps them save time in what they're doing in the lab. So those are some of the new things we're trying. And then moving forward from that, once we get it nailed down in my lab courses, I would like to push the electronic notebooks into our capstone courses, our engineering design courses, so that those are all multidisciplinary, team-based, so they can share a notebook in that format, and just see how this platform helps them through the design process as well when they get to their capstone experience.
We have a few more questions that have come in. This one's from David Locke. Are there plans for LMS integration? There is LMS integration. I can answer that. Let's import the students' information at the beginning of class and export grades back out. We are looking at further integration as well. So Dr. Nocera, do you use LMS integration at all within your class?
We are going to start to. We did not in this past year, but it's something that we've been in contact and discussing with LabArchives on how we can get that to work effectively for us. At Ohio State, we just transitioned from D2L over to Canvas in the last year, And so it's a little bit of a struggle for us to learn a whole new LMS kind of quickly. But we're hoping to do that grade transfer. And one of the things that we would love to see that we've discussed with LabArchives is a way that students just need to go to our learning management system, click on LabArchives, which is within the learning management system, some sort of link that they could click and open that browser within their learning management system so that they aren't trying to log into and manage multiple different websites at one time as they're working in the lab. So that's something that we're interested in and encouraged that we're working towards that in the future. But for right now, if you do decide to do assignments within LabArchives and doing that export into an Excel sheet, I believe that will, in most learning management systems, you can upload that right into your learning management system for your grades.
We have one from Mike Kenny. Have you considered using some type of table to place the digital devices on the lab as a way to eliminate or reduce clutter?
That's actually a really great point, and that would be a good idea. We're a little limited in our setup right now, but we are I'm excited. We're getting a new building in a couple of years, and I have the opportunity to help design what the labs will look like. And one of the things could be a separate table that they could sit on. I've also played around with the idea of having some sort of flip up tablet where it will flip down over the side of the table or hook on to the edge of the table so it could flip up and students can use it and flip it down out of the way when they're not using it. So I think that there's probably some options out there that can help with that.
And then we have another one from Peter Bell. Was there any concerns in this course about contamination of the devices used for recording data in the ELNs? If so, have you worked to mitigate this risk?
Excellent. So yes, there is definitely a risk with that, and that's something that we use as a teaching moment for our students, because there's no doubt they're going to be working in labs and that they're going to have that electronic component, whether it's they're tempted to pick up their cell phone or they're going to go over to a desktop computer in the middle of an experiment and type something there. It's always going to be a risk. So we're using that as a teaching moment for them to say, hey, you really need to be aware of when you're wearing gloves, what's on your gloves, what you're touching when you're wearing gloves. And we're going to stand behind you and let you know if you're touching something you shouldn't be with your gloves, and what to do if you accidentally do, and how to clean that up. So we have turned that into a teaching moment for them, and I think raising that awareness for them. I don't think we're going to be able to avoid electronics no matter what. This is just the way our society is progressing. So by using it as a teaching moment to show students, here's how you can use this these different electronic devices in lab, and these are the precautions you need to take, I think helps prepare them mentally as they move on in their next steps in their careers.
Well, I believe that's it for questions.
Okay.
I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and especially I'd like to thank Dr. Nocera and as well as Monica for leading this session and sharing their results. If at the end of this, you will be receiving a link to where you can watch the recorded version of this session. And if you have any additional questions, please contact or email info@labarchives.com. Thank you and have a great day.